How do Karl Marx, Shakespeare's play Hamlet, and the Frankfurter School resonate? What are the spectres of Marx? And can philosophy change the world for the better? These questions and elements compose today's episode, Marxism. Welcome to Political Compositions, where we explored the last 250 years of political, social, and cultural philosophy. I'm Jamie.
I'm Gijs.
And join us in confronting the foremost philosophers, movements, and ideas from past and present which compose political philosophy today. So turn on, tune in, but don't drop out.
So, Jamie, what can we expect from today's episode?
Well, as this is an episode about Marxism, we'll be discussing Marx. But beyond some of Marx's theoretical insights, we will look at Marxism and its later resurgence as well.
It seems that even though the time of Marx has gone, we cannot say goodbye to Marx himself. We're still dealing with the spectres of Marx, to use an expression by Derrida.
Right, but why is that? Why can't we just say goodbye to Marx?
If only we could. The core problem that Marx formulated is still relevant today. Remember that in our episode on modernity, we saw that the 19th century is the time in which social and political organization becomes a product of our own doing.
Yes, I paid attention. In modernity, society is not some fact out there, a given or natural state of things, but the result of the rules, institutions, and principles upon which we collectively organize ourselves.
Marx emphasized that the social injustice of his time was also a product of our own doing, not in the sense of deliberate product, but still, human beings themselves created it in and through their actions. The capitalist relations of production, so the relationship between those who own the means of production, the capitalist or bourgeoisie, and those who don't, the workers or the proletariat, radically altered the way the economy worked at the time. Factory owners started to appropriate and organize the workflow of previously independent or artisanal workers.
And why precisely is this an important change or problem? Did people feel much better before capitalism? So the feudal system with monarchs, lords, serfs?
Yeah. Now, to be sure, the feudal economy also had its fair share of problems. But at least artisans were known, recognized, and mostly respected for their occupations. They were organized in guilds that oriented them in the whole of their lives. Under capitalism, we are no longer in charge of our own work and its conditions. Yet we are in charge, or even responsible for, the problems that the system of work produces, including the new problem of being unemployed. When some employer or capitalist doesn't want to hire you, there's really not much you can do anymore.
Marx carefully tried to understand these conditions, to see how old ways of life were interrupted or could no longer be maintained. In a 19th century German newspaper, the Rheinische Zeitung, of which he was one of the editors, he wrote a collection of articles on wood theft, or rather the political attempt to stop it.
Wood theft? What did he say about that?
Well, he focuses on the change in the legal system. So in the Middle Ages, there was no sharp distinction possible between private property and public rights, meaning that, say forests were in some sense somebody's property, but still open to public use. However, when industrialization kicks in, these forests become important resources for the production of furniture, housing, and so on. And so the forest owners start accounting for every single tree. Therefore, anytime people would use the forest, say get some wood there, this was now considered theft. And this outraged Marx.
Ah, right. Well, that sounds like a very young Marx.
That's true. He was around 24 at the time. And he was mostly outraged that the people who didn't own the forest now also became criminals for using it.
Sure, the young Marx still goes about his social and political analysis in a very Hegelian way, right? Structural changes in the economy lead to alienation, so an estrangement from the usual ways in which you do things. To stay with this example, whereas people were used to getting wood from a privately owned forest, this was no longer a public right, and people were thereby partially alienated from their way of life.
And alienation being a central concept in Marxist theory.
As it is in Hegel's philosophy. For both of them, it has to do with labor, which is to say, in a philosophical sense, about realization. What we think or say can only become reality through labor, doing something with our own hands, by making a physical effort.
Okay, so no sweat, no realization.
Indeed. But the point here is that once we create something or object through our labor, it becomes something apart from us and thus not under our control. It's part of us, yet not. Part of us is now in the world, so to speak. So we have gained something, but also lost something.
Still, for Marx, alienation doesn't mean exactly the same as it did for Hegel. I mean, there's a difference between realizing or externalizing something and being alienated from it. The artisan, for instance, also realized something, but wasn't specifically alienated from it.
Hegel's perspective is philosophical. Marx's is social. That's sort of the whole point. Marx is Hegel socialized, one could say. Or if you want, when labor is no longer performed within a guild system, where the fruits of labor are directly yours.
Although, of course, there's hierarchy and inequality within the guild, right? I mean, apprentice and master and so on. But I guess the profits gained from pooling your labor in the guild did go directly back into that guild again. In that sense, almost like a cooperative supermarket where the employees own the business.
Something like that. In capitalism, things are very different. In a factory, you might still do the very same labor as in the guild. Only now you don't work for the guild, but for a capitalist, the owner of the factory and of its means of production. This also changes the relations of production, as Marx calls it. You become a wage laborer, and the mechanics of capitalism imply that you as a laborer no longer share in the profits, or the surplus value, as Marx calls it, of your own labor.
Because you sell your labor to the factory owner. So he says, I bought the machines, I own the factory, come work for me and I'll pay you a wage.
Well, technically, Marx says that you sell your labor power, not your labor. But otherwise, yes. The surplus value created by labor falls to the owner of the machines, not to the workers who do the work. That is the basic unfairness of capitalism. More so, by the way, than some evil intent or other moral failures on the part of capitalists, or even the difference in wealth and status between capitalists and proletarians.
Speaking about that, did you know Marx was family of the famous Dutch Philips family who ran the still existing Philips company?
Although Marx died before Philips was founded. And of course, Engels, and in a way Marx, were supported by the surplus value produced by a factory owned by Engels' family. Speaking of alienation.
Indeed. Marx also described this in terms of alienation from our Gattungswesen, or species being.
Gattungswesen. Sounds very much like idealistic philosophy to me. Hegelian or whatever.
It's actually from Ludwig Feuerbach. Like Marx, a so-called young Hegelian. They took specific ideas and insights from Hegel, but gave them a twist. We already spoke about Hegel and the idea of being home in modernity. Species being concerns each individual's relationship to humanity, or being a member of humanity. In Marx's hands, however, species being becomes a tool to analyze the transformations of modernity itself. The life you live is no longer oriented towards becoming a full human being as a result of the social relations in which you have to enter.
The relations of production of capitalism.
So in the movement from Feuerbach to Marx, species being is more the result of how society is structured rather than your personal relation to humanity as such. Being forced in social relations that do not allow you to develop yourself alienates you from human life in general, which is about free development. Marx saw how the workers were no longer allowed to excel as human beings, but basically only as tools. Labor became labor power as a tool for the factory owners. And that didn't require humans to develop themselves on all fronts. You just had to be a productive worker with as minimal a cost as possible.
This all still sounds quite philosophical. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and his co-author Friedrich Engels spell out the political consequences of these ideas in a time when industrialization or capitalism is really coming into its own. Throughout Europe, with the advent of capitalism, all prior standings, estates and so on are dissolved. All the classic oppositions found in society, as they recount, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf.
It sounds like the end of politics to me. No struggle, no opposing groups.
Yes, and although this might sound strange, that was the hope during the French Revolution still. When the feudal system would be undermined, all citizens would be able to equally enjoy political and economic freedom.
Yet that didn't happen. As Marx and Engels write in the Communist Manifesto, the bourgeoisie would summon a new enemy all of its own, the proletariat. The novelty of the bourgeoisie is that, now unshackled from the old feudal system, it creates an entire class of workers with few rights, no wealth, and no power. This class will grow in number and increasingly suffer under the effects of alienation until eventually an uprising is inevitable.
And then there would be another revolution, but now against the bourgeois.
Indeed, a communist revolution in which the workers of the world would unite against capitalism and the bourgeoisie. As the Communist Manifesto put it, the spectre of communism is haunting Europe.
Beep boop, beep bop.
So if the spectre of communism is haunting Europe, what is meant by spectre? And for Derrida, these ghosts are plural. Why is that?
Spectres, or ghosts basically, was taken by Derrida from Shakespeare's drama Hamlet. Famously, the Danish prince Hamlet is visited at his castle Elsinore by the ghost of his dead father, King Hamlet.
I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night. Revenge his foul and most unnatural murder. Most foul, as in the best it is, but this most foul, strange, and unnatural. Fare thee well at once. The glowworm shows the matin to be near, and begins to bale his ineffectual fire. Adieu, adieu, Hamlet. Remember me.
As you'd expect, there's intrigue at the court. The ghost asks Hamlet to avenge him. He reveals that he was poisoned by the new king, Claudius, Hamlet's uncle.
So the spectre of communism that haunts Europe is also a spirit of revenge.
Yes, and it was also a spirit in the sense of brooding presence rather than a strong material reality. There was not much organized communism at the time. We can better see the Communist Manifesto as an attempt to summon the spirit of communism, to bring a new political sentiment to life by claiming that it exists already.
So why the plural then? Why spectres? I believe it is said that Derrida just misremembered whether Marx spoke of a single spectre or multiple spectres.
Who knows? But even if he did, he was right to be wrong, to use this nice Hegel-inspired phrase. The spectre is something that haunts the present, but Derrida shows that rather than a single emerging spirit, many Marxisms have emerged and passed away, but nevertheless leave something behind. A ghostly non-present lives on, despite the fact that the movement, idea or moment has long since been gone. This remainder unsettles the present. Something is off, and on some level we know it.
And that's why the phrase from Hamlet still resonates, the time is out of joint.
Indeed, the time is out of joint, like your shoulder can be out of joint. And Hamlet feels he must set it right, or remember it, put it back together, as the spirit of his father admonished him.
Ah, like the last line of the ghost in the play, remember me.
Followed by adieu, 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 which Derrida also plays with. Anyway, when he was young, perhaps Marx still looked for some remembering or reconciliation. While for Derrida, time will remain out of joint. So we will remain haunted by the ghost of Marx.
Because in another sense, the spectre is Marx himself and how he impacted philosophy, politics, and social life. All right, so we spoke about Marx and about Derrida's understanding of Marxism, but taking his idea of spectres seriously, what are some of the ghostly presents that have haunted social and political life over the last 2 centuries?
There are many. Already during Marx's lifetime, in 1863, there was the International Working Men's Association. As capitalism was international, so should the Working Men's Association be. This organization would become known as the First International.
The First International, meaning there was a second?
And a third, and even a fourth.
Wait, how many working man's associations that we need, especially internationally?
Yeah. Only one, you might think. But the point is more like Derrida's spectres. The first international was formed by trade union representatives from various European countries housed in London. Marx became involved with them while writing Das Kapital.
Ah, a philosopher with an international organization to back him up. That must have been a powerful force.
Actually, from the very beginnings, the first international was marked by internal strife, specifically a conflict between anarchists and Marxists. The anarchists were led by the Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin. He thought that Marx or his Marxism would merely reverse the power relation between bourgeoisie and proletariat, while anarchists want to get rid of any power. Hence the split at the 1872 Congress of the First International in The Hague.
Well, I guess building coalitions has never been easy.
Indeed, by the time Marx died in 1883, the First International is practically defunct, at least the Marxist wing.
So how does the Second International overcome these differences?
They don't. And it gets worse. The Second International in 1889 did manage to agree on an anthem, the Socialist International, but it is characterized by a split between revolutionary Marxists, like Marx had been, and so-called reformists, who believe that we should not just wait for the revolution, created by abstract forces of history, but try to reform capitalism from within. The Marxists, however, thought that this was opportunism.
How paradoxical. So because Marxists were more radical, we could say that they were more passive as well. So, and the Second International was more in agreement than the first time around, but they still fought over how strictly one should adhere to the Marxist doctrine, so to speak.
And predictably, this reformism was criticized by a new generation of revolutionary thinkers, such as Rosa Luxemburg, a Polish-German revolutionary and thinker. And then there was this critic of the Tsarist regime in Russia, who spent a lot of time in exile, read a lot of Marx, and decided that the revolution couldn't wait. This was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known by his partisan name.
Lenin! The Russian Revolution and its leaders were obviously inspired by the writings of Marx when they undertook their revolution.
Indeed. And this revolutionary sentiment gave us the so-called Third International, the Leninist one. Yet there is something of a theoretical mismatch here. Marx's critique of capitalism relied on an analysis of the advanced capitalist relations of production in England. Unfortunately, Russia had neither such economic relations nor a proletariat to match. Russia had really only just abolished serfdom, and most peoples were peasants.
Who therefore weren't as alienated to want to overthrow government then, or?
According to Marx's theory, indeed not. Anyway, after they got rid of the Tsar, they actually held free elections, imagine that.
Okay, who won?
Actually, some agrarian socialist party, nothing much Marxist or Leninist.
It does make sense, though. An agrarian socialist party for a country full of peasants.
Not to Lenin. He and his Bolshevik Communist Party disbanded the assembly and declared the dictatorship of the proletariat.
But wait, there was no proletariat in Russia, right? I mean,
no. So the dictatorship was that of the Bolshevik Party as the de facto legislator and executive.
It sounds a little one-sided, actually.
Yeah, but even Marx himself thought, at least at some point, that indeed a true communist regime would be the merger of legislative and executive, because both would be directly grounded in the very same people, which is actually more a Rousseauian idea than a Marxist one, or perhaps a Rousseauian legacy in Marxism.
In any case, Lenin thought that the real push to overcome their alienation did not have to come from the proletariat itself. Because when you are alienated, it's hard to politically analyze your situation and act on it. Isn't this roughly what we mean with false consciousness?
Therefore, Lenin thought it is up to an educated communist elite or avant-garde to act and think in the place of the proletariat, either absent or present. This, of course, is the Communist Party.
So Lenin was not much of a Democrat.
Well, like Rousseau, he thought the people would likely be politically alienated and thus not to be relied upon. So they were in need of political education, a job for the Communist Party elite, of course, which for communism should anyway replace the state, which was supposed to wither away.
Ah, right. The title of the conference where Derrida first spoke about the spectres of Marx was a play on this, Wither Marxism.
Anyways, the serious political issue here was, as communists, can we reform the state or must we abolish it?
Didn't Lenin think communism could have it both ways? First, in this transition from modern to socialist society, a counter-elite of socialists and communists would have to play an active and harsh role in countering the power of the ruling class, so the bourgeoisie. This would require what Lenin euphemistically called discipline. Once this socialist system was in place, phase two could begin. The authoritative and regulative government apparatuses would fade out and the state would wither away. Being thoroughly disciplined by now, the people would be able to live harmoniously and cooperatively without needing any state.
Well, more a nightmare than a noble dream. Up until the present day, there's discussion whether this nightmare began only with Joseph Stalin or already with Lenin.
So whether Lenin was the communist good guy and Stalin the bad guy.
Right. Slavoj Žižek, for instance, believes that the nightmare already began with Lenin.
So Lenin was already a bad guy, so to speak. Wait, I thought Zizek was a Leninist himself.
He was, or is. But it's more of a when the going gets tough, the tough get going kind of argument. If you want to make an omelette, you need to break eggs, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, Rosa Luxemburg, for one, was critical of Lenin, although for different reasons than we might think at first. It wasn't violence per se that she shunned, as Luxemburg was an active revolutionary herself, who was both involved in party politics, but also in activist action, and even revolutionary violence. She was ultimately betrayed and assassinated herself.
Betrayal. The ultimate fear of anyone who fights for a political cause.
All too true. So Luxemburg was particularly critical of the notion of this avant-garde, which she didn't think belonged to a properly Marxist attempt at a socialist revolution. Such a revolution would always have to involve and be grounded in the people at large, not some counter-elite.
Which, for political action, that makes it all the more difficult.
Right. I mean, it meant that there had to be a continuous involvement of the proletariat, so the workers in the factories, with their political organization. So to coordinate between factories, regions, and so on, and to keep everybody convinced of the political program or change it accordingly to what the workers thought was important.
Okay, so an almost impossible task within a modern advanced state.
I guess for us now it might seem so, but we have to imagine that in those days it was quite common for revolutionaries to think it would happen. They just didn't think it would be in Russia.
Okay, so where did the revolutionaries think the present was pregnant with the future of the communism then?
Where else but Berlin?
Berlin, right. But it didn't really work out, did it?
No, I believe the closest they got was what is now called the November Revolution in 1918, which mostly failed. I mean, Germany became a parliamentary republic, although this so-called Weimar Republic was not a very stable one.
Although artistically and intellectually, it was an exciting place. But it soon fell prey to right-wing extremism, which wanted revenge for the defeat in the war. And eventually, of course, to the Nazis.
Also a kind of revolution, maybe, but of a very different kind. Okay, so is the communist revolution that never came to Berlin the end of the story of Marxism?
More like the beginning of new forms of Marxism, sometimes called Western Marxism, meaning Marxism not under the control of Moscow or Lenin or Stalin.
One of those being the Frankfurt School, also known as the Institut für Sozialforschung.
In itself remarkable that such an institute managed to get off the ground in those days, in those circumstances.
Well, its founder, Felix Weil, was the son of a wealthy Jewish grain merchant, and he used his father's funds to set up a new school on Marxism.
So a bit like Marx and Engels being funded by the factory of Engels' father. But hey, let's be realistic. Who's going to fund such an institute otherwise?
Right.
Let's be happy that at least a part of the surplus value is put to good use in this way.
But the institute had a false start, so to speak. Karl Grünberg, the first director, belonged to the Austrian school of Marxism, which was heavily focused on the later works of Marx. So to try and strictly analyze with almost a scientific approach economic changes, and they worked closely together with the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. He has been called a Katheder Marxist or a lectern Marxist.
Yeah, so more economics than philosophy. That doesn't really sound like the Frankfurt School that we know and love.
Indeed, I guess more academic than political.
The school changed considerably when a new director was appointed, however, Max Horkheimer. And with him came a whole new group of theorists who are still read today. Theodor Adorno, but also Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, Walter Benjamin.
So then it was full throttle into radical philosophical Marxism, Western style.
Not quite so. Economic and social conditions made it quite difficult to pin down exactly who the proletariat, the working class, was and what they supposedly were thinking, especially from an empirical point of view, as one of the aims of the Frankfurt School was to connect philosophy to the social sciences. In a way, following up on Marx's 11 theses, which we talked about.
Philosophy has hitherto only interpreted the world differently. The point is to change it.
That's it. So the social sciences were meant to make philosophy more relevant.
And did that work?
Not always. Ironically, the very first project initiated by Horkheimer and actually carried out by Erich Fromm was a social psychological survey to establish whether factory workers could be said to have a proletarian consciousness.
As one would expect from a classical Marxist point of view, working at the assembly line was supposed to determine your consciousness. But what was ironic about it?
There turned out not to exist any class consciousness whatsoever, at least not in Frankfurt. While the survey was intended by Horkheimer to provide empirical proof that Marxism was more than just some doctrine, proof that he could show to possible future patrons of the Institute.
What a shame. Horkheimer argued in traditional critical theory that critical theory is about looking at the meaning and direction of society in order to change it for the better, whereas traditional theory merely tried to understand it.
There's the 11th thesis again.
So how can theory both understand and change the world? The Marxist point and the Frankfurt School's problem is that traditional economic theory is itself already ideological, as it already entails a bias for understanding over acting. And rather than trying to figure out how the world should be and how to get there, social science is content with describing how things are. Think of sociology, which aims to describe social phenomena, but can then also stereotype people, label them, or categorize them. And once such a category comes into existence, it's hard to get rid of it.
It is. So, for instance, the proletarian as a political or philosophical entity becomes an empirical category ready for counting and thereby normalizing.
Right. So critical theory for the Frankfurters became about a broad analysis of society, not just its economic domain, in order to understand the various injustices of the world. The world is wrong. And then try to remedy them. Critical theory has the explicit goal of human emancipation through self-reflection.
Which also shows the way in which the Frankfurt approach does keep a sociological dimension. Critical theorists start with society as it presents itself, but do this in order to ask how it should be changed.
Which would later be called the retrieval of immanent norms. The critical theorist looks for gaps between emancipatory norms that may be implicit in existing practice, but are not realized in it. They establish a contradiction within this practice, which is to be resolved. Through such a reconstruction, they find immanent ways to criticize a practice. And like Hegel, they call this process dialectical.
Talking about dialectics, I think we would be remiss not to mention here what is probably the most famous work to come out of the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer and Adorno's joint work Dialektik der Aufklärung, or Dialectic of Enlightenment. We mentioned that for the Frankfurters, there's something really wrong with the world. Well, this book fits this bill more than any other.
Absolutely. Throughout the 1930s, the situation for Jewish Marxists, as most members of the Frankfurt School were, took a turn for the worst. As for all German Jews, obviously. Hitler came to power, fascism was on the rise, and at the time, the capitalist economic system started to expand beyond the confines of politics and economics. Also, the autonomy of art was under siege.
Art, one of Adorno's pet subjects. For him, art was the only domain in which truth still had some chance of manifesting itself in this world.
Not all art, though, I suppose.
Certainly not. Music was at the top of Adorno's list. Classical music, mind you. And especially atonal music. The new music of the beginning of the 20th century. By composers like Arnold Schoenberg and Alban Berg.
Wait, this was Adorno himself, right? I know he was also a composer.
Yes, and a very promising one. although I don't think many people will like his music. Especially his piano music is very dark and brooding, even for post-existentialist atonal music. But in the end, he wanted to be a philosopher even more than he wanted to be a composer.
And there's actually not much about music in the Dialectiek der Aufklärung, is there?
No, not really. Adorno had wished there to be much more about music in the book. But he thought he wouldn't be able to sell this to Horkheimer, who was not that into music. But that's part of the private dialectic between the two of them, which is a fascinating topic in its own right. Anyway, completely at the bottom of Adorno's list of art was Hollywood, just about the ugliest place Adorno could imagine.
Right, because completely commercialized and thus completely alienated. I mean, by the 1930s, film had moved its center of gravity from Europe, where it was considered a form of art, to the United States, and more specifically to Hollywood. The issue with Hollywood, however, was its studio system. Individual directors or artists didn't have much of a say. Instead, large corporations, studios, developed formulas in which producers would collect good-looking, young, and famous American actors called stars.
I can feel Adorno shivering.
Anyways, this film industry business exactly stands for the kind of commodification that Adorno and Horkheimer decry in their book. The process of something turning into a commodity that is a product no longer produced for a specific use, but to sell on the market, as Marx himself already described it. In Hollywood, films are made just to make money.
So you'd think that Hollywood was the last place in the world where highbrow German Marxist intellectuals like Horkheimer and Adorno would want to be found. But ironically, that is where they lived when writing the Dialectiek der Aufklärung, condemning the very Hollywood they lived just a couple of blocks away from.
So wait, how did they actually end up there?
They were in exile, having managed to escape Nazi Germany. In the case of Adorno and his fiancée Greta Karplus, was a lot of trouble, and get on a boat to the United States.
You think European intellectuals like that would be more at home in New York? Why didn't they go there?
They did. Actually, they founded an institution there to replace the Frankfurter School, somewhat aptly named the New School. It's still in existence today, by the way, and quite prominent, not unlike the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research.
Then why did they move to Hollywood?
Yeah, something to do with Horkheimer's health, apparently. The mild California climate would do him good. But also academic health. The cooperation with Columbia University in the upper northwest of New York, especially its sociology department, at first seemed very promising, but it soon turned sour. Not so easy to translate Hegelian Jewish Germanness into American empirical sociology.
So Horkheimer and Adorno didn't just grapple with the specter of Marx, but also their own exile became a ghost that haunted their philosophy.
Yes, well, your exile is never really your own, isn't it? It's something that stays with you, often in uncomfortable ways. But people deal with that in very different ways. Look, for instance, at Hannah Arendt, also a German Jewish intellectual war refugee, who perhaps didn't like America that much either, but was able to flourish there nevertheless.
Not so much our Frankfurters. They were too Hegelian for that, too German, and too cultured.
And too Marxist.
And too Marxist. This podcast was made possible by the Erasmus School of Philosophy and the Center for Learning and Innovation at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. A special mention goes out to Mirjam Fuselier and Sun Liu. Thank you, Sam Vitikainen, for the beautiful opening and closing theme. Daniel Nolet for his expert mastering. And thanks to Ludo de Bo for his insights and guidance in this project. Finally, we would like to thank our editor extraordinaire, Max Wassink.